Across England from midnight, new borders in the land. Tier 2 rules apply here, right next door to the Tier 3 rules applying here. And many can't fathom why the lines have been drawn where they have.
It is very difficult to explain to our constituents why tomorrow morning they will be waking up to Tier 3 restrictions.
We went in Tier 1, we've come out in Tier 2. My pubs and restaurants are in the worst of all worlds.
We will look in granular detail, Mr. Speaker, at local incidents, look at the human geography of the pandemic.
But from midnight, the geography of tiers is stark. Only 750,000 in England are in the lowest tier, Tier 1. The remaining millions are either in Tier 2 or Tier 3. That's 99% of the population barred from socialising indoors. Near Bristol, two neighbouring parts of Somerset, one in Tier 2, one in Tier 3. One with pubs and restaurants open from tomorrow. A few miles down the road, they'll be shut.
It just feels like they haven't bothered to sort of separate things out as much as they could have.
Not far from the Prince of Waterloo in Winford is Chew Magna, where restaurants like the Lazy Lobster are in Tier 2 and maybe about to get quite busy.
We're surrounded by Tier 3, so it's a double-edged sword, really. It's, do you become the COVID police or do you run your business?
With debate overnight about what constitutes the substantial meal you're required to have with a drink out, some Tory MPs said COVID regulations were becoming a mockery.
I put to the Prime Minister last week the thoughts of a constituent who said that if the government imposes stupid rules, people will stop obeying the sensible rules as well. This was sadly dismissed. Since then, the national debate has moved on to how big a Scotch egg has to be to constitute a substantial meal. I rest my case.
The Prime Minister told his MPs not to desert him now, with vaccines on the way. This could be the last new plan for COVID, the last phase of the battle.
All we need to do now, Mr. Speaker, is to hold our nerve until these vaccines are indeed in our grasp and indeed being injected into our arms.
Restrictions.
The Prime Minister had attacked Labour for abstaining on tonight's vote.
And we will allow these restrictions to pass. But it's another wasted... Well, we accept the case for restrictions. We want a plan that's going to work. We're on Plan 5 and this one's full of holes. We have been there so many times. So many times the Prime Minister stood there and said, this is the plan, this is the plan, this will solve the problem.
Do you think there's a danger Labour looks like it's silent on these major issues tonight?
I think abstaining always risks that. Everyone's got an opinion on this in the country. It would be dangerous, I think, to assume that members of the public will be satisfied if they think that members of Parliament don't have an opinion on this huge matter.
But it's the rebellion in Tory territory tonight that is setting records. The vote tonight, what does it portend? The Tory party can be quite vicious when it doesn't like a leader. You know about that.
Well, of course, because this is different. This is about prime ministers, and prime ministers have the right to govern and do have the right to expect support from their parties.
It's a horrible place for a party leader, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, to be, isn't it, tonight?
It is a terrible place to be, and I have absolute sympathy for anyone leading through this.
The Prime Minister promised he'd make the tiers more sensitive to local geography. There could well be more places moving down the tier structure. One former minister said that didn't sound like a hard commitment. He was going to rebel to keep the pressure on the government.
And of course, we'll speak to Gary later when we have a result. Well, that vote is happening right now. They are voting to approve the new tier restrictions in England. The new system will divide England into 3 tiers and would come into force tomorrow if approved. In a moment, we'll speak to the Tory MP and chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride, who decided in the end to support the government tonight. None of the MPs who said that they'd rebel wanted to talk to us, but I'm joined now by Lord Jonathan Sumption, a former Supreme Court judge who supports their view. Good evening, Lord Sumption. Why do you support the rebels?
It's not a question of supporting the rebels. It's simply a question of opposing the government's measures. My reasons will not necessarily be the same as theirs, though I think they clearly overlap. The problem about the tier system is that it is completely indiscriminate and arbitrary. And this has been a problem ever since the outset of this crisis, when the government decided to use the criminal law against the entire population of this country as its main tool of policy.
OK, Lord Sumption, I'm going to just interrupt you there right now. We're going to just go to the vote right now. Let's just have a listen.
The noes to the left, 78.
The ayes to the right, 291. The noes to the left, 78. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock.
OK, so let's go. I'm going to get to you, Lord Sumption, in a minute. Let's go to Gary Gibbon, our political editor. Gary, 78 voted against. That's a lot more than the 34 who voted against it last time.
It is. We don't know exactly how many Labour votes were there. There were going to be some Labour dissidents, but I think we can probably safely say this is the largest Tory rebellion of this Parliament, and it is quite a significant one. We don't know also how many abstentions there were. Quite a lot of Tory MPs were talking about abstaining as well. These are pretty discouraging figures for the government. There was a well-organised plan on the other side. The COVID research group, the Tory MPs have come together and mimicked the ERG, which did so much damage to Theresa May and others. They've come together. There's a template there for how to operate, and their guerrilla warfare has come up with tonight's numbers. They hope this puts the pressure on the government not only to pull back from some of the tiers that they put people into in December, but also in January not to carry on with this. You talk to people in that group and they say they just don't believe that the vaccine is going to come along and sort things out at speed, and they want to put pressure on to make sure that when this tier system that has now passed, that does come into effect midnight in England, when it comes to renewing that, they don't want to see it renewed in this form. They want either lots of people down in lower tiers or a different structure altogether.
And briefly, Gary, does this weaken the Prime Minister in the long term?
Yes, I mean, it's not quite the same order of the very, very political disputes that were happening with Theresa May on Brexit, but it is wounding. We know that rebelling against a leader can be habit-forming, and there are already some in this cohort of people who've gone through the No Lobby tonight who are forming those habits, but some people who've never rebelled in a decade in Parliament. And so the worry for the whips for the government will be that this does destabilise Boris Johnson. They'll be hoping that when it comes to January, a few tweaks here and there, a few adjustments maybe, and the atmospherics of vaccine maybe being rolled out, that will make the whole thing then actually doable, and they can carry on with some sort of restrictions in the country that look probably quite a lot like tonight's. But they can't be sure of it, because those Tory rebels, there were an awful lot of them tonight who said, OK, I've got one piece of paper from Matt Hancock in my hand that says my constituency's going to be looked at again. I'm going to hold you to this. Some of them saying I'm going to hold you to it in December, which is a very tall order. But even if they try and hold him to it in January and hope that things are reconfigured, well, that's an awful lot of civil servants sweating through the Christmas holidays.
It is indeed. Paul and Gary Gibbon, thanks very much. Lord Sumption, back to you. Thanks for your patience here. So we've now calculated that 56 Tory MPs have voted against the government. It's not a victory for the people who share your opinions, but does it not just send a mixed message to the country? And there's nothing worse for the country and nothing better for the virus than a mixed message.
Well, I would prefer an unmixed message. I quite agree. But I think that there is very little scope for compromise, because the problem really is the decision, as I suggested earlier, to use the criminal law against the whole population as the main tool of government policy. The problem is that law is a blunt instrument. It depends on having precise definitions on exact categories, and it leaves no space for individual judgment, for discretion, or indeed for common sense. And the situation is actually far too complicated to be dealt with in this crude, one-size-fits-all way. We are all different in significant ways. This is a serious illness for some people and a mild one for others. Some of us are old, some of us are young. Some of us live in high R areas, some in low R areas. And the same applies to people with whom we might mix. The tier system takes no account of any of these differences. The government needs to trust people to make their own decisions instead of treating them like cretins.
Lord Sumption, stay with us. I'm going to bring in Mel Stride, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee. Mel Stride, you were dithering, I believe, until yesterday, and I think you tweeted that you didn't like the evidence that you saw from the government about the economic impact of this, and yet you decided to back the government, I gather. Why did you do that?
Well, I've always been consistent, actually, Matt, in saying that I would support the government, but I've also equally been consistent in saying that the economic analysis, which undoubtedly the Treasury and the government has around the economic impact of these measures, has not been forthcoming. And as you know, the government produced a document yesterday that purported to put this information forward so MPs could consider it. And in fact, it was just really a rehash of information that's already out there, principally from the Office for Budget Responsibility and their forecasts of the 25th of November. So it was with a heavy heart that I supported the government today, but as I think that information should have been made available. But nonetheless, my judgment was that it was the right thing to do.
So you weren't following the economic science, you were following the party loyalty on this one?
No, not at all. I was just left having to consider a less than full set of information that I would like to have had, but having looked at the information that was available and having listened very carefully to the arguments around the spread of the virus and the potential consequences if we don't keep on top of it, and the fact that a vaccine is nearby and almost within touching distance next year, I felt on balance it was the right thing to go for a tiered approach, which does allow the treatment of different areas in a different way. What I think will matter hugely now, incidentally, is whether the Prime Minister can effectively deliver on his pledge to introduce greater granularity into the way in which this particular approach works. If he fails to do that at the time of the next review, and certainly in January, then I think there'll be very significant problems in the future.
Yeah. I wonder how the word granularity will go down with, pub owners and restaurant owners in your constituency who have been offered by the Prime Minister £1,000 if they're out of business. £1,000 at this time of year when you're trying to make up all the lost business of the rest of the year, that's not going to persuade them. That's not going to keep them happy, is it?
I think you're right in the sense that for pubs, of course, wet pubs that are now having to close in many areas, December is a hugely important month, and £1,000 for most of them will, not go nowhere near to make up the kind of losses that they're going to suffer. It should be borne in mind, of course, that the government has provided a huge amount of support to business, and the hospitality sector in particular. The IMF themselves recognise that as being one of the most solid levels of support in the world. Nonetheless, it is certainly a fair point that you make. I don't think that £1,000 is going to go anywhere near making up the kind of difference of the suffering that will happen. But granularity matters because it means that you can then more clearly identify the areas where the virus is more under control and ease off from restrictions. And of course, that in turn will help those businesses in that area, including pubs.
But the virus doesn't really care about county lines. The virus will travel. And even if you lock down one area in Tier 2 and the other one in Tier 1 in the same district, in the same area, in the same county, you're going to get a rise in infections, aren't you?
Well, that's where work needs to be done, I believe, to allow greater granularity and to tackle and take an informed view of that particular issue. And it's something that Matt Hancock in his winding up speech in the House just before the vote made a strong point about, is that they will be doing the work to attempt to do that. But there are no easy answers to this. If you've got a very high rate of infection in one area and then just a few miles away a very low rate of infection, and yet you've got people travelling between the two, there's no magic wand that solves that problem. You have to make a judgment overall looking at the total area as to whether it makes sense in different tiers. And that's what the government needs to do more of, I think, in order to win the support of backbenchers, some of whom, like myself, my constituency in Devon, has a low level of infection, but we're still in Tier 2. We want to be in Tier 1.
All right, let me just bring in Lord Sumption at the end, and briefly, if I may, Lord Sumption. The government has welcomed the result of this vote, even though they got a bloody nose. I mean, doesn't Boris Johnson have a point? We should hold our nerve for a few more months. This is for Christmas, not forever, in order to really try and defeat the virus. And by doing this, we might actually risk a third lockdown and a third wave of infection. Lord Sumption.
The problem about that analysis is that it assumes that the only thing that matters is public health. And that is wrong. There are other things that matter. Liberty matters, human dignity matters, basic humanity matters, and jobs matter. The jobs that we've seen lost, 25,000 in the last 2 days, are very serious matters, and they are not being caused by the pandemic. They are being caused entirely by the government's countermeasures.
Got to go. Sorry to interrupt you, Lord Sumption, but we've literally run out of time. Lord Sumption, Mel Stride, thank you very much indeed. John.